Okay, so welcome to the Leader Campus series. This is a presentation about ethics in the workplace. And I actually ran this presentation in my Bramble office today, so I would invite you to come visit my Bramble office. I'll put the address later and at the bottom of this presentation that you guys can actually see it. It's a really fun place, and if you see here on this area where my little arrow is, this is actually my office, so that's where my students come talk to me. So I'm going to skip some of the slides in which I had some logistics for people on Bramble and go straight to um, the slide where we're going to actually start. And that is the question that I always ask in my presentations about ethics. My first question is, are you ethical? And I ask this question of people, oh man, in conferences, when I speak on keynotes, when I speak to leaders, when I do this as part of leadership development or employee development. And not surprisingly to you, everybody says that, yes, I am ethical. And when I ask them why they say that, they usually say, I'm ethical because I learned it from my parents, because I learned it from my family, because I had very strong values growing up. So my question then is, if we all think we are ethical, then how come there are ethical violations? That is the main theme of this presentation. That is, why do we experience ethical violations in ourselves and others if we all are so confident that we're ethical? In fact, it's hard for you to add ethics to any kind of leadership program or so on because people think they're ethical, so therefore they don't need to have any conversations about that. The next question that I always ask people when I'm talking about ethics is a question that was asked of me from my professor, Dr. Patrick Balkin at Bowling Green State University when I was studying ethics for the first time. And he would ask us always, what will you do with the power you were given? So the idea is that whether you are in an official leadership role or whether you have influence on your friends or your children or your loved ones or on anybody, you are a leader. And if you are a leader and you have influence on others, that means you have power. So what do you do with that power? And that's why the topic of ethics becomes so important. Okay. So here's the roadmap that we're going to be talking about. An office dilemma, circles of ethics, compassion or fairness, and slow down. So the office dilemma is a study that I ran with a group of people from Linked HR. So I'm going to share with you what the office dilemma is and then explain what the differences are between three groups who read that dilemma. Then I'm going to go into a theory that I call circles of ethics. Then we're going to talk about the differences between compassion and fairness and whether those two things happen equally in the workplace. And finally, I will share some questions that you can ask yourself as you're trying to solve a moral dilemma. All right, so here we go. So let's start with an office dilemma. This is the dilemma that I shared in a study that I did with one of my then graduate students, Tim Kozitsa, and my brother Carlos de Melo Souza. We ran a big study on that. The dilemma that was shared with people was, there's an employee, the employee is highly conscientious, has always done great, and all employees in that organization must attend a monthly meeting. And actually attending that meeting is so important in that organization for whatever strange reason that attendance to that meeting is tied to the bonus, and the bonus is significant. It's equal to 1 month's salary. So you are the HR manager, and as you're coming out of the meeting, you were told that you were not told, you see an employee leaving. Now, here's where there's a twist, is that when I do this live, I send people to different tables. And actually, in my Bramble room, there were like different projects, I guess, assigned to each of the tables. If you clicked on the link, it would give you a slightly different story, and that was to reproduce the study that we did. So one group just found out exactly what I told you. The second group found out exactly what I told you, but there was a twist, and that is the employee in question had a child, and the child had cancer, and the family was going through hard times. And then the third table, or the third type of briefing, said exactly the same thing. There was still a child with cancer, there was still the family going through hard times, but the twist was that was a very close friend of yours who had helped you in the past. And what we wanted to know in our study was whether people were going to answer differently depending on whether it was a friend or a non-friend, and whether it was a person that you had some empathy for because you knew some special circumstances or you didn't know. Okay, you can probably guess what the answer is going to be, but before I go there, so I sent people to make that decision in the real meeting, and before I go there, there's something that I want to explain to you, and that is, what is a moral dilemma? Because what I just gave you was a moral dilemma. Do you report or not report the person? Now, the moral dilemma may seem pretty simple if you don't know anything about the person, but if you know that the child has cancer, well, do you go for compassion or do you go for fairness? And if you know that it's a very close friend of yours, do you prioritize friendship and love and loyalty, or do you prioritize your obligations as a manager? That may sound simple, but basically a moral dilemma is usually a value dilemma. It's a dilemma between what values you're going to prioritize. So let me give you another definition of a moral dilemma. A moral dilemma is a complicated problem. It's a difficult issue. And that difficult issue has significant impact. What I told people in the presentation this morning is that if the dilemma is whether you buy Skittles or whether you buy, I don't know, Fritos, that's not really a moral dilemma because it doesn't have a significant impact other than, I don't know, maybe the number of calories that you get on each of those. Okay? So it has a significant impact, but you're between a rock and a hard place in as much as any decision that you choose is going to be right and wrong at the same time. There is no decision that is necessarily all right or all wrong. And no matter what you decide, somebody is going to get hurt. So just to recap, a moral dilemma is a significant problem with difficult solution, with a serious impact, with no right or wrong answers, and whatever you decide, somebody is going to get hurt. So that's what a moral dilemma means. And one of the problems that I see in ethics development and leadership development involving ethics in organizations is that we think that if we just give people a rule book or a set of policies or this is the way we do things around here and thou shalt not take gifts from your clients or whatever it is, what we're forgetting is that a lot of the moral dilemmas are not that clear cut. It's not just about, do I take this TV or don't I take this TV? Do I steal $5 or don't I steal $5? You're talking about significant impact and something in which the rightfulness, the right or the wrong components of the dilemma are not clear. Okay. So moral dilemmas have to do with difficult choices. In fact, I would add that moral dilemmas have to do with impossible choices. Choices between values that are very dear to you. In fact, often we call those choices tragic choices. And they are tragic because they are pitting one very significant, one very important value to you from another. Very often in organizations, I see those beautiful pictures on the walls about what the value X and value Y, so we believe in this and we believe in that, but where push comes to shove is, okay, if one of these values that you think are super important, like we work together and we value our people, we're pitted against we are productive and we value our shareholders, which one would win? And sometimes there are values that are super important for the organization, and guess what? They are not written on the wall. So moral dilemmas are always value dilemmas. Keep that in mind. Okay, so one of the things that I ask people is to think about moral dilemmas that somebody in your role can experience at work. And since you're watching this at home, I would suggest that you pause the tape now, just jot some things down. Of course, you won't have to share this with anybody, but think about a moral dilemma that you have experienced or that you could experience that is common for you. And when you're done, continue the tape. All right, so hopefully you are done. So now let's talk about what the study was. We received, I think, 1,500 answers, but in all those studies in which you have like tons of people participating, we ended up with 1,248 usable answers that hadn't forgotten or weren't outliers or something like that, right? So we had more than 1,200 people whose answers we could actually use. They were members of Linked HR, which is a mega group on LinkedIn with more than 1 million people. 69% were female, 76% were Anglophones. That means from a country where English is spoken, such as Australia, England, the United States, Canada. Now I'm trying to remember if there was any other country, but only the countries where English was mostly spoken as a primary language. 57% identified themselves as being from the HR field, and 46% were managers, just for you to understand who they are. Now, before I share the results, I wanted to share with you something called the Circles of Ethics. And the Circles of Ethics is a theory, I guess, that I came up with when I was in my doctoral studies at Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio. Of course, at that time, I was working on my doctorate, and I thought I had come up with the coolest thing ever. And ever since then, I discovered that far more important people than me have also come up with similar ideas, even though they don't exactly have my series of concentric circles. They still have a similar thought about how we reason about ethics and how we make ethical decisions. So here's what happened. In that course at Bowling Green State University, I was asked to work on my code of ethics, which is a common exercise in ethics development, ethics courses. And my code of ethics was beautiful. My code of ethics was like a piece of perfection. It made me look like Mother Teresa. But then I started asking myself, for whom would I violate my code? This here is my daughter Maggie. So what I asked myself was, would I violate my code for my daughter? And this is a picture of what my daughter might have looked like at around that time. So would I violate my code for her? And my answer had to be yes. Now, the next picture is a picture that most of us have during the pandemic of a lot of us having a meeting on Zoom. So this is my family, right? Having a big family gathering. So then my question is, would I violate my code of ethics for my family? And my friend, this is my friend Elisa. She's my best friend since we were 12. Would I violate my code of ethics for her? And finally, this is me at age 18. Would I violate my code of ethics for myself? So as a summary, if you think about a series of concentric circles that start from you and your loved ones, your children, or maybe people who are young and you are really, really close to your heart, and then your more extended family, and maybe your friends, and your community, and if you're a churchgoer or if you worship with a community, your members of your religion, members of your direct religious community, or your compatriots, people from your country, do you think differently about ethical dilemmas when you're dealing with somebody who is far away than when you're dealing with somebody who's close to you? And going back to our study, would people then answer differently when we said, this is your close friend, than when we said, this was just a very conscientious employee? So in all cases, they were conscientious employees, but does it matter if the conscientious employee is your close friend and when your conscientious employee is not your close friend? So basically, the question that we were asking ourselves as researchers were, do we think differently as we move closer to the center of our circle? And is it possible that justice and fairness requires some distance? In other words, for you to really throw the rule book at somebody, Do you need to be far away from them? Or are you going to be creative in your interpretation of what the rule book says when that person is close to you? And what we found is that care and compassion seem to be more likely when you are close to someone. That may not surprise you, that may seem pretty obvious, but what was surprising to us is that we were talking about managers, we were talking about HR professionals, and if you're not in the HR field, just know that HR is a very policy-driven field. It's a field that people really worry a lot about fairness and consistency and not treating people differently. So the fact that those were HR professionals was really surprising to us, that the results were so strong. And the results were pretty darn strong. So the closer you got, so the friend got far more leniency than the non-friend. And what was even more fascinating to us as we analyzed the qualitative responses, because our study also had those, is that even when people would report the employee who had missed the crazy meeting, when it was a friend, they would reinterpret the story in their heads so that they could actually be more lenient. So it would run kind of like this. Well, I know this person really is going through serious problems, and I would have to bring up the problem to my manager, but I would make sure that I advocated for the person because, after all, they deserve it. And those kinds of creative responses were not coming up when people did not know the other person from Adam. So that concern for care and compassion requires closeness. So to summarize, the farther you get from your circle, the easier it is for you to apply justice and fairness. And the closer you get to your circle, the most likely you are to use care and compassion. So then this is another moment in which I would ask you guys to stop and just take some notes or reflect for yourself. Have you experienced the circles of ethics in your personal life? And most importantly, have you experienced the circles of ethics at work? Have there been situations in which you felt very tempted to be more lenient towards somebody who was closer to you? And in those situations, what did you actually end up by doing? And be careful, because what happens to our mind is that we tend to reinterpret the dilemma so that we can favor our friend and not feel unfair. Because nobody likes to look at themselves in the mirror and say, I'm not ethical. Okay? All right, so answer that question and then come back. All right. Hopefully you answered the question, and welcome back. So let's talk about the study results. When friends were involved, people used significantly more care and compassion. Not only those results were pretty clear, the effects were also pretty strong. So it was not just statistically significant but not practically important. People favored their friends. Also, when friends were involved, people were more lenient. So not only they were using more care and compassion in their thinking, because in our study we had a scale to measure that, but they were also making decisions that were more lenient towards the person who had made the violation. And by the way, on purpose, we chose a violation that was not particularly serious. Nobody was killing anybody. Nobody was stealing gobbles of money from the organization. We came up with something simple, which is not attending a meeting, because we wanted to see what would happen when the situation was not that clear cut. And when the situation was not that clear cut and friends were involved, people were much more lenient. Okay, people changed the situation to protect their friends. So what I just said to you guys in terms of we're likely to rethink the story or rewrite the story, well, the person wasn't really leaving the meeting. The person was going to come back. I'm sure the person had actually told somebody. So actually things that were not in the case were literally invented by the person, so as to, or they didn't realize they were inventing it. That's where their brain goes. So not only we're more lenient, we recreate the scenario so that we can be even more lenient, because now the scenario deserves more leniency. Does that make sense? And all that happens unconsciously and super, super fast. There is a book by Jonathan Haidt called The Righteous Mind, and which I strongly recommend. It's a fantastic book. And one of the things that Jonathan Haidt says is that what normally happens to people is we have a very quick, instantaneous moral intuition, and we reason afterwards not to actually make a decision, but to justify the decision we've already made. So when friends are involved, compassion, it's what I have on the screen, is not an equal opportunity employer. When friends are involved, our moral intuition is that one of compassion. And then everything that happens afterwards is thinking on how you can make sure that you are compassionate, even if that means changing the story that you were given to begin with. Okay, so then now what? What do you do about the situation? So the main thing that I will say is slow down, because intuition is super fast and your reasoning is happening after the intuition. So there are some questions that you may want to ask yourself. One of the questions is, have you considered other options? Because if you haven't considered other options, I would argue that you're not really making a decision. You can only make a decision if you are weighing different possibilities. Have you considered both compassion and fairness as you were reaching your decision? Have you included people with different perspectives? And what I mean by different perspectives is people who are farther or closer to the people who are involved. Now, mind you, when I say farther or closer, I'm not only talking about friends or non-friends. I'm talking about people who are members of your circle. So remember gender, position in the organization, race, ethnicity, religion, department in the organization, whether they are in the headquarters or somewhere else. All those things generate proximity. So basically, when you're trying to make a big decision, you should have people, representatives from all those groups, so as to make a decision that is more ethical. And the last question I find particularly important, and that is, if this person were closer or farther away from you, considering all those parameters that I just gave you, would your decision be different? So basically, that's what I wanted to share with you. If you couldn't join us in the live meeting, I hope you can join us in a future live meeting. And if you have any questions, I'm going to put my contact information below. Thank you so much, everybody. Bye-bye.